Good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to begin. And you're really fortunate tonight. Usually we bring in one excellent scholar. Now we have two. And they are related to one another. And, they are at the top of their field in what they do. I'll introduce Matt first, but as I can tell you, because I'm even more familiar with Elizabeth's work, introducing her last is by no means least. Matthew Spalding is the Associate Vice President and Dean of Educational Programs at Hillsdale's program in Washington, D.C. He runs the Kirby Center, and Matt has a long and distinguished pedigree in Washington, D.C., many years at the Heritage Foundation as Vice President of the American Studies Program and founding director of the Simon Center. Matt is also the author of several superb books. Let me just mention two excellent ones. His bestseller, We Hold These Truths, is one of the best examinations of our founding principles and how they are currently under assault. It's a magnificent book. Matt co-authored what I consider to be probably the best book on the Washington's Farewell Address. That's not all. He's executive editor also of the Heritage Foundation's line-by-line authoritative study of the Constitution that is the state-of-the-art for introducing anybody to serious constitutional study. Elizabeth is by no means least. She's an associate professor at Claremont University. She runs the Washington, D.C. program, and she is the author of two outstanding books. Well, let me tell you about one of them. She wrote, Not Even Close, the best intellectual biography of Harry Truman there is. I know that because I had the honor of being the reviewer for publishing that book for the University Press of Kentucky, and thanks to Elizabeth, they will publish, after I write my next book, 3 books of mine, thanks to my getting the refracted glow of her credibility. Elizabeth and her dad, Lee Edwards, who is really the founding father of serious study of conservative thought, also wrote recently a superb, best, concise, scholarly, impeccable study of the history of the Cold War that gets everything right and conveys it with concision and absolute impeccable scholarship. So we're lucky to have both of them, and tonight is going to be the form of a panel discussion. What's going to happen is, I think, given there was a dispute, given that in my house the wife usually wins, and I'm going to assume that's the case, Matt has lost the battle. He will therefore be speaking first. Elizabeth will follow him, and then we'll have a panel discussion about President Trump's presidency and where it fits in or doesn't, including the caveats to conservatism as we have understood it, particularly as Ronald Reagan has defined it. And then after a discussion, we will allow, except for some of you that I know, questions from the audience. You're one of the persons banished. For the most part, there will be free inquiry on the part of the audience with certain enumerated exceptions. Thank you for being here, and Matt, why don't you start?
You sure? I prefer to...
Domestic policy has to precede foreign policy.
Thanks, Bob. It's great to be with you. We were thinking earlier, this might be our first time to Boulder. we're happy to be here. That was a kind introduction, not kind enough to Elizabeth, since she is a wonderful scholar.
Is there a microphone?
We're going to speak up. It's great to have us both here. When we got married as graduate students, one of the things we had to do was to combine our libraries. And I had all my books and she had all her books. And I studied mostly the American founding and early history prior to the American founding, early American history. She studied more contemporary American history, especially the Cold War, the Reagan era, Cold War. And so what we did is we combined our libraries and started to meet in the middle someplace. But we have multiple copies of some books because, of course, when you're a student, you can't get rid of the books you wrote in, right? It's actually, this is fun. But our topic is the Trump presidency from the point of view of domestic and foreign policy. What are we to make of that? What it might mean for conservatism. So I'm going to go first. I'm talking about domestic policy, although my guess is that Elizabeth will have plenty of great comments on this as well. And I want to just open by making some brief comments, and I've got other things I want to hopefully pick up on or that Bob will ask about. Because I have a slightly probably different assessment of Trump and what's actually going on in American politics. This particular president is someone, shall we say, is easily to get distracted about. And all of the various immediate things, his personality, his style, his tweeting, whatever it might be, distracts us from what larger things might be going on. But if we step back and take a broader view, I think he is in many ways captured something about the moment that, interestingly enough, some of the top Republican candidates in a very crowded primary field were unable to see. And to his credit, he saw it. And there was something about it that he picked up on, which I think demands us to back up and think about it a little bit. I can't say that he was my first choice, probably not my second or third choice, and I can go on. But at a certain point, we had a binary choice that forced, which is what American politics and a two-party system is supposed to do, made us choose between alternatives. And he posed that to some extent, sometimes inarticulate, in stark terms. And I think that has something to do with a broader crisis, shall we say, of what's going on, what's been going on for some time in American politics. And I think that Trump in many ways represents that moment and is a product of that moment more than he is the creator of it. Trump is a deconstructing figure, if you will. He's broken down what we had come to understand to be what the left represents, what the right represents, what liberalism and conservatism is. Both political parties have become very comfortable in here are 10 issues, here are 12 issues, and you check the boxes. He had no patience with that. And he made arguments, and he made them, in many cases, very directly, and in ways that he didn't care how he was perceived. But in doing so, I think he, as I mentioned earlier, saw something. And to make that point, let me back up and put it in broader historical terms for a moment. When I first started watching Trump, and actually during the primaries, watched some of his rallies, my first reaction to him was that he struck me as a 19th century politician. Which is to say that if you study the 19th century, of course we think of the 19th century, we think of Abraham Lincoln, the great statesman. But what we usually don't think of are all those politicians, many of whom became president, who were less than perfect, shall we say, who focused on a few issues, handled some of them well, some of them not so well, but became presidents and, in hindsight, turned out to do some things that were oftentimes pretty good. Trump, I think, fits that pattern. We've been going on for some time in American politics towards a different way of governing ourselves. Go back to the beginning of the 19th century, into the 19th, early beginning of the 20th century. Prior to that, American politics had been defined by constitutional politics. We thought of branches of government, executives and Congress, legislation, Supreme Court, the way politics and government is supposed to work. But over the course of the 20th century, a new way of thinking about politics has been coming up. Largely the result of something called the progressive movement, which sought to change how this worked and encourage expert rule, what we'd say would call bureaucrats, and encourage Congress, the legislative branch, to delegate more and more of its power to the executive, and the executive branch to absorb more and more power onto itself. And the real laws are oftentimes passed through bureaucrats and agencies and departments. And this was an argument in favor of this new way of governing that really became the design of modern liberalism. Conservatism, to the extent that it came to represent an idea, it has different forms and different people we can talk about, was an attempt, which really begins in the early 20th century, an attempt to go back and conserve an older way of doing things, which was to conserve some modicum of a constitutional structure, of a separation of powers, of acting within the rule of law, and deferring to the legislative branch first and foremost. Well, these two views have been battling over the course of the 20th century, and I think conservatism and republicanism especially have gotten comfortable with that battle. It was going nowhere. Liberalism was being largely successful as a form, but the political battle was even. It was pretty much divided in much of the country. Trump, I think, represents the frustration of lots of the American people, lots of the mainstream American voters, that many of the things they believe in had been ignored for too long. He also picked up on several issues, which we're now seeing coming out. Trade, immigration, tax policies, but especially bureaucratic elite rule. Those things actually fit together into a pattern, into an argument that, despite how inconsistent or how much he likes to tweak and step on his own toes and seems to be going hither and yon, there's an argument that he's making and representing. It's not fully made. It's not, I think in domestic policy it's less articulated than it seems to be in foreign policy, but he's presenting an argument. And I think if you look at it from that perspective, ignore for a moment the personality, ignore for a moment the heat of the back and forth trying to stop his policies between left and right, but look from the larger perspective of what is actually occurring. This, by all intents and purposes, despite my very low expectations, has thus far been a very successful presidency in terms of those policies. In terms of the judiciary, in terms of regulatory reform, in terms of tax policy, and all those various pieces. So oddly enough, the most unpredictable, wild, crazy election and the most unusual presidency in our lifetimes for sure, if not for the last 100 years, I think has turned out to be, thus far, and there's a lot more to be seen, a very forceful, solid presidency that perhaps unintentionally is moving us back towards constitutional government, which I assess to be a very valuable, good thing for the country.
I would like like to add to what Matthew said, that it's a pleasure to be here with you all, and to thank Bob for having us. And we've been enjoying walking around Boulder earlier today in the relatively warm weather compared to what we've had this winter in Washington, D.C. So I've been tasked with foreign policy, and I am trying to grapple, just like Matthew is, with what's Trump doing, what does he think, what does it mean for now and for the future, and where does Trump fit with what has preceded him. Around Washington, D.C., there's a raging debate, it won't surprise you to know, about Donald Trump and his foreign policy. And in that regard, there are outliers in looking at foreign policy in Washington, but there's more consensus on foreign policy than in domestic policy when you're talking about people who are on Capitol Hill or people who are in think tanks, which is a major part of DC, or people who are in the mass media. And that mainstream kind of spectrum, sometimes called the Washington establishment, really goes from somewhat liberal, but not very liberal, to somewhat conservative, but not overly conservative. And there's going to be more agreement within that range than you would find in domestic policy, where it really does tend to be more pulled between conservative and liberal, between Republican and Democratic. So Trump is different in some ways, I think, in foreign policy, but I wouldn't say he's a revolutionary figure. And I think probably people are being surprised by how his foreign policy is playing out. And there have been more and more experts in Washington who are saying that he actually resembles a somewhat normal Republican in terms of his foreign policy. I am still working my way through that, because then to me I have to say, well, what does normal Republican mean? But I'm looking at that as a thesis, I guess, to be tested. There are also plenty of people in Washington who think that he's a crazy person in foreign policy, and he's going to get us into a war. And those people might sort of be on the left end of the mainstream spectrum that I've described to you, or even sort of on the neoconservative side of that same spectrum. So there are people who are still not very sure of him, and certainly all of the people who call themselves never-Trumpers are still in that category. So part of what makes it difficult to assess Trump is biography. He has a lack of political experience. This is part of what makes him so different. And in foreign policy especially, we want to know that our presidents have some sort of worldview, that they have a conception of what America looks like in the world. And here is Trump with a lack of political experience in every possible way coming to the Oval Office. So I think that's something that we actually have to keep in mind, because sometimes somebody will state it and then they forget about it. But it's very important, especially in foreign policy, where it's so much about the single person of the executive, and him being so key to everything about it. Another thing to keep in mind is that he's a businessman, and this gets thrown around a lot, but I think that many people in Washington forget that he's a real estate businessman. And so maybe some of you actually have careers in real estate, I don't know, but I haven't done that career. But to me, it seems like a particular type of business and a particular type of businessman, and that we have to keep that in mind, because a lot of the transactions that we keep hearing about with other leaders around the world, it might help people to understand them better if they're remembering that he's a real estate businessman. Another piece about Trump that people will just state and then drop right away is that he's a New Yorker. I don't know why this doesn't get more play. I don't know why the real estate one doesn't get more play, and I don't know why the New Yorker one doesn't get more play. Because I think that both of those are really important pieces to trying to understand Donald Trump. And in Washington, few pay attention to this. They think Washington's the center of everything. Obviously, New Yorkers think that New York is the center of everything. So you actually have two very important cities, two global cities in many ways. And Washington, of course, is still the political power capital of the world. So it does trump New York there. But these are elements that we have to keep in mind about Trump that just don't get repeated enough or explored enough. If they're said and dropped. Then I think in trying to understand Trump and what it means for foreign policy, the next thing to look at is to pay attention to the people, the advisors around him, especially those that come into play in foreign policy. For Trump, to the extent that he has an understanding of politics, it's very personal. So that would mean that even more than usual, personnel matters, right, in terms of the impact on policy. In Washington, personnel is policy is actually a maxim. It's one of these phrases that's always thrown around. But I think it's even more important to keep in mind with Trump because he does have this very personal understanding of anything political. So in terms of the, for the moment, but transitioning team, the top people in foreign policy would be Secretary of Defense Mattis, Secretary of State Tillerson, now pretty much gone, and you have an acting Secretary of State. The National Security Advisor McMaster, also on his way out, and then the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Haley. That team is now transitioning to still Mattis at Defense, but now we'll have a new Secretary of State, Pompeo, if he's confirmed. Do we want to do predictions? He'll be confirmed. So all three of us predict that he will be confirmed, so you can come back and give us a hard time if he doesn't get confirmed for some reason. And then a new National Security Advisor in the form of Bolton. And then still Haley at the United Nations on behalf of the United States. So we can talk a little bit more about what that all means. And Bob here is an expert on all these players too. But I think that that's the next piece about trying to grapple with Trump and understand his place in foreign policy that we have to focus on. And then this next piece, which I've already alluded to, is usually we would talk about a new president's approach to the world, his worldview. What did he bring to the White House before he became president? What is coming in with him? And a lot of presidents come to the Oval Office with some relatively formed worldview, even if they haven't done a lot in foreign policy. In recent history, Trump is actually a little bit more like both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, Bush 43. And all three of them, in different ways, didn't come to the White House with a well-formed worldview. And Trump, though, probably beats the other two in terms of global travel, at least. And certainly his experiences in business would have given him a wide range that neither of the other two had. And Bush 43 had a lot of experience, at least with politics with respect to Mexico as governor of Texas, but he wasn't well traveled outside of that. So we want to keep that part in mind. And so with all of that, I'd like to run through what seems to be emerging in a Trump-type approach to foreign policy, and which we can discuss more as we go. So one, there seems to be an emerging type of American nationalism. Now, if you're scared, this is a real problem because it's going to be fascism, or it already is. If you're pro-Trump, then he doesn't sound outside of the norm of what you hear when people talk about what's in the national interest. But certainly, Trump has brought back the notion that there's an American interest and he's pursuing it, and that American nationalism is a good thing. Other countries can have their nationalism too. This is actually the best way for things to operate in the world, if everybody's focused on their respective nationalism. And I would echo Matthew in saying that this harkens back to the 19th century in some ways. It's kind of a pre-ideological nationalism that predates what we fought in World War II and the Cold War, and ideology coming out as such an important factor in those global crises. Number two, Trump tends to talk about a trio of concepts or principles in a lot of his speeches. I'd say so far that his main foreign policy speeches have been the one that he gave in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, the one in Warsaw, Poland, the one at the United Nations in New York, the one in Seoul in South Korea, and then he gave a brief speech, but an important speech, before he issued the national security strategy, or before the executive branch issued the national security strategy. And all of those came last year, in 2017. So frequently in these speeches, he will talk about three things. Two of them are nearly always 100% the same, and then the third rotates. So the two that are nearly always the same are security and prosperity. So if you think about this, think about how many times you hear him say prosperity or security. And it's in there, it's in the speeches, it's in some of the tweets as well. And then the rotating slot is sometimes sovereignty, and it is important to him. He says sovereignty often. Peace, strength comes up quite a bit, and then occasionally freedom. And that kind of depends on the circumstances of the speech or the statement, whatever he's saying at the time. So security, prosperity, and then some rotating cast of sovereignty, peace, strength, or freedom. And we want to think about what that means, but it does definitely point to how he's thinking about America and the world, and how he's thinking about foreign policy, and how he's thinking about other countries. Number three, I don't think I've ever written this as sort of a principle for a president. Success. Success is all important for Donald Trump, especially economic. I mean, he's constantly talking about how we're doing economically and how the economy is improving, and he's proud of that. And whether it's the imagery of how he's a builder, or talking about how there are more people back at work and bringing jobs back to America, all of this. But he sees the world around him in terms of wins and losses. In IR theory, international relations theory, we talk about him having more of a zero-sum game view of the world. But the word he uses is success, and he'll say about how something is working, and it's a success, and it's nice, and it's good, and all his different adjectives. Number four, Trump thinks that threats are real and need to be confronted. So we've just come off of a two-term president, President Obama, who acknowledged that there were threats, but really wanted to see the world in more cooperative terms, and think that that we were moving on, we had reached the 21st century. To talk about threats and problems was so old school, was so 20th century, was so 19th century. Trump thinks that threats are real. So for Trump, these threats take the form of extremist or jihadist terrorism. He uses different expressions to convey that. North Korea, and then he doesn't always name them by name, but if you go and you look actually at what he's saying, Russia, maybe not Putin, but Russia is a threat, and China, maybe not Xi, is also a threat. So I would put those on the list. And then Iran. that one comes up as a threat pretty consistently. And then sort of a crime syndicate. Some of them are transnational, some of them are in one place largely, but they're doing crime across countries, across places. That one ends up in there frequently. So most of these threats are state-based, but they're not all. The ones that aren't state-based often get support from other hostile nation states. So that's number 4. And then number 5, this one's again more conceptual, kind of like the security, prosperity, and the rotating third. Trump has started to, in his own way, use the term peace through strength quite a bit. And he's used that in speeches and in tweets. And you probably most associate that with Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, and his presidency. And so it could be that Trump thinks he's taking that and applying it in his own time. But he clearly likes that phrase. And for him, it reflects various things, but a couple of points here. One is that armed diplomacy, not just talking, but having the force to back it up, is both important and effective in his mind. And then it's good to talk about that a lot, because I think that one comes up over and over again, the peace through strength, and that I've got the muscle to back it up, according to Trump. So with that, I think we can open it up to more discussion. Maybe Bob has some things he wants to say first.
Just,
Great.
I'll have some questions and for both of you. Matt, I'll start with you. I agree that President Trump does not fit into Michael Barone's distinction between conviction and consensus politicians. He's a distinct category, and he's a volatile one because I believe Trump is the first Republican that Trump has ever voted for at the presidential level, which does not inspire deep confidence about his commitment to Republican principles. Yet, on substance, he has governed, with the possible exception of trade and with the harder edge of his immigration language. Ronald Reagan used to say that he'd always settle for 80%. Hasn't Trump, for all his rhetoric, really governed domestically at least the way a Republican like Ronald Reagan would understand and probably approve of substantively, if not rhetorically?
No, I think that's right. It's odd. But if you look at where he is and what he's actually doing, and you're a conservative, this is the most successful presidency since the Reagan presidency. What's going on with judges? Remember during the election, right? The argument for you've got this choice between these two candidates, and neither one of them is attractive, right? What's he going to do? The best argument at the time was, well, he'll appoint good judges, and maybe a few other things. But he's done much more than that. And in his way, I think there are many ways in which, when it comes from the point of view of style and elegance, Reagan was the master of that. His argument was much more attractive, and he attracted people to his argument. Right? That's a weakness, I think, of Trump. Is the rhetorical weakness, which is important. But having said that, the substance of what he's doing, I think, is actually very Reagan-esque. We have to remember, Reagan did not run for president saying he was going to abolish Social Security. There are many ways in which Reagan moderated many things. Reagan did have his position on immigration in many ways articulated much better, was not dissimilar. Right? He accepted the deal that Trump has actually offered. Reagan didn't get his into the deal. And Reagan also always said that the '86 immigration reform was his biggest mistake in domestic policy. Even on trade, oddly enough, right? Reagan's a free trader, and articulated the theory of free trade, but he also sometimes imposed tariffs. Famously imposing tariffs to save, remember, Harley-Davidson, right? That was a tariff to save that particular company because he thought that was good for America. So there are oddly ways in which I think he is actually acting like a conservative president. Now, is he doing it from conviction? No. Is he doing it because he's read all these books? No. But oddly enough, I think he understands politics today better than many of us understand politics, which is what I meant by saying he's a 19th century politician. He's not an ideological politician. He's not doctrinaire. But he sees politics, and he picks up on it in a way that I think he's articulating a populism. Remember, Reagan was a populist. That kind of is that working class populism that has many parallels, I think, back to the Reagan roots.
Elizabeth, you mentioned that Trump was a New Yorker. I want to develop that a little bit. He's not just a New Yorker. He's New York City, which is never translated. And he's not just New York City. He's an outer boroughs, brown shoe, brawler, not a New York Athletic Club guy, with a New York edge that scares people. And I'm going to bring your dad in, who's knows more about Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan than
anybody else. Yeah,
than everybody else knows. One of the things your dad mentioned is that Barry Goldwater, no matter what he said, given the way he said it, would scare the daylights out of people. Ronald Reagan had a way of saying the very same thing, reassuring people. How much of our distress with Trump is our preoccupation with the theatrics rather than the substance of what he says and does?
I think that a lot of it has to do with temperament. And I think that temperament in a president does matter. So on the it's not so bad side, I do think that many are focused on the theatrics, and that often when you go back and read what Trump said, it's not as bad as when you heard it and you parse through everything word by word and you say, oh, okay, well, that's true, shouldn't have put it that way. Oh, I don't like that over there, but the bottom line, kind of okay, right? And so much of it is how he presents it, and I do think that from a conservative perspective, if you're talking about the difference between a Goldwater and a Reagan, that Trump is definitely in the, people just see him saying it how he says it, they're not even looking at what he's saying, and they run screaming. So yes, I agree with that. But on the I'm concerned side of the equation, I do think that temperament has to then be connected to character. And the president is, the one person sitting there in the Oval Office, and it's not 100 presidents like it is in the Senate. It's one person. And so when you combine the temperament with the character, it's troubling to me, especially, frankly, in domestic policy as well as foreign policy, but especially in foreign policy, where he is the main voice for everything we do in the world. And then my further concern, because I'm always teaching 20-year-olds, and they stay 20 with each class, and I move on. But I've noticed a decline in students' understanding of the presidency and what they think, even if they're willing to respect a president, and it's been growing over time. But I think that Trump will add to that. It's not as if we now have somebody. We don't always have somebody totally admirable, but somebody mostly admirable, and I think he'll tarnish the office. I think he already has tarnished the office. So I'm concerned about what that means over time for students who have, as smart as they may be, and I teach very smart students, but they have a very short attention span, and they don't have the kind of optimism toward government that they might have if you had a more admirable figure in the Oval Office.
Expanding on that.
But we have interesting dinner table conversations. I think you're right. I think Trump is not a Reagan figure in that sense, right? I mean, Barry Gold was as we like to say, Old Testament, right? Fire and brimstone. Reagan was a New Testament figure, right? About optimism in the future. Trump is clearly coming in. He's Old Testament.
He's not Old Testament.
Our pre-Old Testament. But he's breaking the chain, right? He's crass. His personal life is less than perfect. His character is questionable. All of that is true. The question is, have we in our politics come to a point in the development of how the modern state works, which I would argue is such that we're less and less ruling ourselves and self-governing through the old constitutional structure, and more being ruled by a class within both parties that the American people have less influence over, that it took a populist figure like a Trump, an outsider, to break through all that? I think the answer is yes, which means you're willing to put up with a lot of stuff, recognizing full well what you got, with the knowledge that the real question then becomes what happens next, right? Because the Trumpism has to lead to a Reagan-esque figure or an argument, an idea that Trump either hasn't or can't articulate. But I think it took him to break through that. How many were there? 30 candidates in the primary? I can't remember. I mean, none of them could have done it. None of them could have done it. They were just kind of, it was rote. They were just saying it. They were mouthing the terms, and Trump came along and broke these things down and brought up questions that we thought had been settled for a long time.
But he benefited from there being 17 of them up there, and
He
had
did.
his plurality.
He did.
He hadn't had that many people up there.
Yeah, but the end it came down to 2, and then to 3, and then to 2.
I know, but there was a long period where he just kept racking it up, kept going along.
Elizabeth.
He benefited from that big field, I think.
While I'm very sympathetic with your concerns, and I don't know how to resolve them, expanding on what Matt had to say, Victor Davis Hanson, who I think has written as perceptively as anybody about this, said, look, Trump is like chemotherapy. It has negative byproducts.
And you hope you don't die from it.
You hope you don't die from it. You don't like it, but it may be necessary. And expanding on what Matt said and thinking about it, I think back to that moment in the 2012 presidential campaign with Candy Crowley interjecting herself in a debate. And Mitt Romney, in a gentlemanly, meek way, allowed that to happen rather than take a rhetorical 2x4.
Right.
And expanding on what Matt had to say, given where we are and the inability at least in the current atmosphere, of Republicans to win by being a gentleman. Does it take something like a Trump with all of its warts and all of its dangers? And if it does, how do we move from this expedient of chemotherapy to something more elevated? Because you're Claremont trained, you emphasize the importance of character, and in this election, 2016, you had Lady Macbeth running against Andrew Dice Clay in a seat. How do we accept the need for this without making this the new normal, to quote Daniel Patrick Moynihan, defining deviancy?
Oh my gosh, yes, yeah.
I give you my answer, which is, so what my hope was when Trump got the nomination, was going to be the candidate, and then he was going to win, there would be enough, the check on him would be Congress, which is to say that the way the American system is designed is your answer. It's the Madisonian answer. Which is that the presidency is checked by a legislative branch and a judicial branch. And the interaction of those branches, called the separation of powers, tends to have a moderating effect. That would define, that would kind of force things to be defined in legislative terms, and would have an effect in terms of shaping how the party plays all this out. And in the meantime, you would have other people coming into existence, candidates, other elections, and the system would come back to norm. To some extent, that's happened. Not necessarily because of Congress. I think Congress is AWOL. And I don't know why. I have great respect, and I have very good friends in Congress. And I just, they don't get it, I think. They don't get that politics has changed on them. Having said that, again, oddly enough, and it's hard to explain, this presidency is doing more to push back from an imperial presidency. He's deferring to Congress on a lot of things. The stuff going on in the regulatory area is revolutionary. All of these things are diminishing the power of the modern executive, which should revive the legislative power. And if that happens, and if you get the courts, going back to what courts ought to be doing, you get the system working again, right? Our muscles, our political muscles are atrophied. We don't know how to work, right? And Trump's broken through all this, and now we're learning again how to operate. What do? How do we pass laws, right? Well, if that plays out, I think we're actually at much safer ground so that politics can move forward. I don't think it's necessarily the case that Trump is followed by Trump 2 or 3. It's highly likely that he is an aberration in a way, but a necessary aberration, I would argue. That's actually for the good of the country. And now we got to figure out, how do you go back to normal politics? And I think that he's broken it up in a way that will encourage people to figure out how to go back to normal politics.
I would add to that something I don't think we know fully and may not know until memoirs are written and then maybe even archives are open, is the role of Vice President Pence in all of this. He is, I think, behind the scenes doing quite a lot, and we do know that he's somebody who believes in the checks and balances and separation of powers and the branches of government and all that, and he understands how they work. So I would like to think that he's, okay, this guy won't do a tutorial with me because that would involve, too much time, but that he's helping Trump understand certain things along. Yeah, right, exactly.
Expanding on that point, I think Vice President Pence is even more pivotal internationally.
Right.
Let me build on what Matt said, that how would you respond to my comment to you that you should be pretty happy with Trump's foreign policy given where he started?
Yes.
If you went back to the campaign and went back to that interview he gave with the Washington Post editorial board where he sounded like a Lindbergh version of an America Firster, I think people legitimately, and I was one of them, feared that Trump was going to diminish American power and continue with a different rationale what Obama had done.
Exactly, yeah.
When you look at what Trump has put in place, even the people who are around him now from those who are around him, John Bolton is an internationalist,
Right.
Mike Pompeo is an internationalist, Nikki Haley is an internationalist with deep resonance, or should be, to neoconservatives. I don't even get how anti-Trumpers on the foreign policy side, like Max Boot, can sustain that position given where Trump has moved.
Right.
And one other thing I want to throw out to you, and this will probably further damage my reputation forever. I think when...
It's hard to do, but...
Don't underestimate me. In my most recent book, one of the pivot points of Obama's presidency was backing down on that Syrian red line, which resonated in East Asia and Ukraine.
Right.
I think when this history is going to be written, one of the most pivotal things that Trump did is move the embassy to Jerusalem. Here's why. It's not just its effect on the Middle East. The rest of the world has come to the conclusion, this guy is serious.
Right.
And if you look at Jim Mattis's defense statement of January 2018, he said China's our #1 threat, Russia's #2, North Korea's 3, Iran is #4. You know, no more global warming, no more failed states,
Right.
no more nuclear weapons, unilateral restraint. This is a traditional great power, geopolitically grounded view of the world, which is a vast improvement on the previous 8 years. Shouldn't we be optimistic and encouraging President Trump, who seems to have a learning curve? He got rid of Mike Flynn. He got rid of Tillerson, who had no deep view.
Right.
It seems, and I think Vice President Pence probably deserves credit, that he has evolved about 80 to 90% of where people who are concerned about him internationally, they should be delighted rather than fearful.
Yes.
I largely agree with what you said. I think that Trump is actually proving a corrective to our foreign policy throughout the post-Cold War era. We never, after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed, we didn't actually have a really serious conversation about our role in the world and our foreign policy overall. There were some people who had discussions about that, but as a country, we didn't walk through, okay, what does this mean now that we should be doing? And so the Clinton administration benefited from a very positive economic situation, and Clinton sort of fell into some of his themes about enlargement, especially economic enlargement and globalization. And he wouldn't have been able to do that if he had faced other political circumstances, but he had the surplus of the Cold War, if you will, to draw on. And this was the theme then of that administration, saying that we were the indispensable nation in the world. And indeed, we're indispensable, but it was okay. If you've got that military, why not use it? That was from Secretary of State Albright. And so there wasn't even a serious conversation about the continuation of NATO and what that would mean in a post-Cold War context. And then we had President George W. Bush come in, and he was not, as I said, one of these people who had a well-formed worldview coming into the White House. He, on the campaign trail, he was getting a pretty consistent tutorial on foreign policy from Condoleezza Rice, who went on to be his first national security advisor and later Secretary of State. But he was somebody that really formed his worldview in light of September 11th. You know, the terrorist attacks happened, and then he found out what he believed about the world. And a lot of what he settled on is better than what we now criticize, because it all comes down to Iraq, and everybody just criticizes, you know, it's like everything's tainted because of Iraq. But much of what he was talking about was fine for foreign policy, but it was not something that could apply to a world outside of understanding 9/11 as an existential threat for the rest of our lives in a way. And then we had President Barack Obama, who made it clear that so much of what he was trying to do was what he saw as a correction to the excesses of Bush 43. And so he did have a more developed worldview, much of it based on his personal experiences and his growing up and all of that. But he was somebody who, over time, developed a real reluctance to do certain things in foreign policy, yet then still relied on technology, especially drones, and also targeted assassinations to get other things done. So it's a very interesting, and obviously he really wanted to, by his second term, achieve some goals in foreign policy to leave as a legacy, and so some of that is what comes out in the Iran deal and the opening to Cuba, especially. And now we have Trump, even though he doesn't have the philosophy, doesn't have the worldview, doesn't have all of this, what he's doing in foreign policy along the lines of what Bob is describing, what I said in the opening remarks, is actually more concrete and sensible, and it is more like to quote you, a great power kind of straightforward approach.
It's also a reaction to George W. Bush.
It is also a reaction.
Both Obama and Trump are reacting.
I think Trump is reacting to both Obama and to George W. Bush, and it's very interesting. This is where, you know, don't any of these guys have any thoughts of their own, because it's three reactive, you know, in a row in some ways, presidencies. But what's missing, and you know, I want more. But what's missing is, can he now add, or can people around him help him add, the part of American foreign policy which has been best about us, which understands the regime distinction, and understands that it matters what kind of government all these different nation states have that are doing things in the world.
Although I want to read it, in foreign policy he's actually much more articulate, though. I mean, those foreign policy speeches are pretty good.
Yes.
There isn't the equivalent in domestic policy.
No,
Policy,
it's curious.
it's really hard to point to a clear statement of what Trumpism is. The pieces are there, you point to things, but in foreign policy, there actually is an attempt to articulate an argument, which seems to be pretty good.
One more question from me to both of you before we open it up to questions. What is your deepest reservation about the Trump presidency as we move ahead?
I think the potential for long-term toxic effects on the American character and our citizenry.
My biggest fear is that it fails, which is to say that I think the circumstances that created Trump are the bad spot we've gotten ourselves into, and it's true in this as in anything else. If you want to take on the established political regime, and he does, you've got to get it. And if you lose that, I think we will lose a lot of ground in terms of the larger fight for constitutionalism.
Well, thank you, and let's open it up for questions, and I'll let the panelists choose and not prejudge, as I would. So far, I would disqualify about half the questions.
No, you pick them.
No, you pick them, I'll give them a chance.
The guy in the back raised his hand first, so how about that?
I know
Is that is okay?
he's acceptable. Closer to it.
You passed the first screening.
It's not a tough standard, given your competition.
Remarks that are helpful.
Can you speak up a little bit, please?
You described Trump as a man without conviction, and that's probably right, as much as I can tell, but I can't tell. And so is it Trump making policy, or is it these people that are back in now power around Trump making policy? Does he care? I'm confused about this.
Well, I think it's actually different in foreign domestic policy, but in foreign policy, he's surrounded by some pretty impressive people. In domestic policy, I think he's actually calling a lot of the shots, which goes back to the campaign. He does have, when I say he's a man without conviction, does not mean it's completely a blank slate, right? I mean, a lot of political figures are without conviction, right? That's why we call some people conviction politicians. He's not that. He's a 19th century politician. He looks at politics. What do the people think? Where's my coalition? How am I going to maneuver, right? And he's got pretty good instincts. I mean, take the trade policy, for instance. I mean, none of his advisors wanted to do that. That was the first major person who quit in his administration who was over trade policy. It's probably bad economic policy, but it's not necessarily bad politics, because he sees something in the fact that free trade is not necessarily good for all Americans. And a lot of those people out there in the Midwest who voted for me are not benefiting from the free trade regime, right? He sees the politics of that. That's I think he's instinctive politically when it comes to a lot of domestic issues.
And then for foreign policy, I think he's made it clear that he'd like to delegate the doing of it and the day-to-day details of it to people that he respects and thinks are successful and who know what they're doing. And so Mattis certainly fits the bill. I think Trump's going to be more comfortable with both Pompeo and Bolton, even though he won't agree with them entirely, but he's going to be much more comfortable with them and agree with them a lot. And so I do think he's developing how he thinks about the world overall, but he's not on a, he won't even get the daily briefings of the kind that previous presidents took. And he's saying, well, Mad Dog Mattis knows what he's doing. He'll let me know if I really need to know something. As far as we can tell, and again, some stuff we don't know. We just don't know. Not everything is leaked, even though a lot does leak. With these speeches, there's kind of a theme to each of the major speeches that he's given around the world, including the UN speech. And they show, in Saudi Arabia and Riyadh, he was talking about how allies in the Middle East have to take on more of the battle of fighting the terrorists, and that the United States is with them, but they have to do it too. So that was definitely a theme in that speech. In Warsaw, it was a theme about the West, and is the survival of the West going to actually happen? And he was both praising Poland for its rich history as part of the West, but also telling Poland and everywhere else that cares about this, that this is a crucial fight right now for the future of civilization. And in Washington, there were so many people, oh my gosh, how could he talk about civilization? How could he talk about the West? But that was definitely the theme of that speech. In New York, he was talking a lot about the threats around the world, if you go back and read that speech. So that threat-based assessment, and that even though he didn't name them all by name, the big threats that Mattis then recapitulated in the defense strategy are all there. In Seoul, it's all about how South Korea built itself as now a good democratic regime and overcame a lot to get there. And then so much of it is about the horrible nature of the regime of North Korea. So here I am saying he doesn't understand the regime, and in that speech it all comes out that he actually does.
But he's the one that called him Rocket Man.
Yes, that's actually brilliant. That's brilliant. That one doesn't bother me. A lot of people around town, oh my gosh, he called him Rocket Man, and I'm like, play the Elton John and sing the song, and this is a good thing. And then all of this sort of leads up to. So the national security strategy that each administration is supposed to issue annually, and it never gets issued annually. But the Trump administration put the first one out at the end of the first year, which is unheard of. It's never been put out that early. And the people who wrote that on behalf of Trump, they really tried to understand Trump and his approach. So in trying to grapple and work through our confusion, it's actually worth going and scanning that. A lot of it's boilerplate government language, but the people who were pivotal to the writing of it, McMaster was one of them, but then he delegated to a couple of very smart women on the National Security Council the writing, a lot of the collection and writing of it. And to read, the most important thing from a presidency point of view is to read the letter at the front of the national security strategy. So there's a letter from Trump at the beginning of it. And actually, if you're interested in this, you can go back and read the letter from presidents in front of each national security strategy, and you learn quite a lot. But that one shows, again, some of these points and themes that I was trying to bring out that are surprisingly, shockingly, stunningly building a kind of coherence in Trump's foreign policy.
Let me mention one of the most outstanding people in that regard, Nadia Shadlow on the National Security Council, and this pertains to Trump's statement about his surge in Afghanistan, which is revolutionary in a positive direction. And this is Nadia Shadlow. Her fingerprints are all over this. Trump understands this, his predecessor did not, that you cannot make withdrawal the priority when you use force, or that's a recipe for defeat.
Yeah.
What Trump said with regard to Afghanistan in particular and in general is that when we use force, there will be a condition-based criteria for withdrawal, meaning not till the mission's done, rather than making withdrawal the priority. And Trump, in some ways, even on the values side, illustrates the comment attributed to Mark Twain, and it wasn't Mark Twain who said this of Wagner. It's better than it sounds. And I think that a lot of Trump, even on the issues where he's most deficient, rhetorically, ideals, the importance of regime type, the actual substance of what he's done is much more consistent with an understanding of the importance of those variables than you would think by judging him based on the rhetoric alone.
Yeah, I don't want to agree, but I agree.
Okay.
We don't even know whom to pick now,
Warm, cold.
See the guy with the beard over there?
Yeah.
Don't pick him.
Yes. The guy with the big beard, he's
See the redhead over there? Don't pick
Lovely
her.
terrier. Lovely terrier.
It's reassuring to think that behind Trump's seeming inconsistencies, there is some advisory system that works. You mentioned Pence, but just looking at this week seems to argue the opposite. This business of sending National Guard down to the wall and the whole trade war thing with China seems to speak to the fact that Trump acts on impulse and he shoots from the hip, trying to sort of put this into the framework of some rational advisory system seems far-fetched.
So I think he's still getting advice from people on those matters too. Right, he doesn't always take it. He's not the first, though, to send the National Guard or to talk about sending the National Guard. So I don't even think that's an impulse. That's I mean, at least a couple of others I can think of, including Obama.
What's going to be the military?
Right. So he walked.
He wasn't talking about the National Guard.
Well, he's sending both, is my understanding.
But even on trade, even
No,
on
yeah, he
trade,
backed out. He walked back.
let's suppose you are a free trader, and I am. And I'm not sure what Trump's conviction is here. Is he a protectionist, or does he believe that a quid pro quo is necessary to make trade truly free? Well, let's be blunt. The Chinese have been practicing predatory politics, and they're the greatest danger we have geopolitically. According to most estimates, we're losing $200 billion a year at a minimum just on the theft of our intellectual property alone, currency manipulation. Most of Western Europe has a value-added tax of between 18 and 21%. If you're for free trade and the other side isn't behaving that way and taking unilateral advantage, and I'm not sure this is Trump's motivation, but it's a plausible hypothesis, isn't something like what Trump is doing necessary to make trade truly free? That's a question I raise in rebuttal to your suggestion, which is plausible, that maybe it is random.
I mean, it is clear that he's got thin skin. He picks fights. He often says something that he regrets, or that everyone else regrets. He steps on his own media. Right? This week is going to be about X, and it turns out it's all about something else. All that is true. Having said that, I do think there is some consistency to what he's trying to do. I don't think he's doing anything that is not easily predicted based on what he's told us the whole time he ran for president, which is say he wants to secure the nation's borders, because without borders you don't have a nation. How he does it, he's picking fights, he's got critics all over the place, he's maneuvering. On trade, he's very consistently said that we don't have a free trade system. I think the silver or the aluminum, the original tariffs he came up with, he's already moderated those. He backed away. Larry Kudlow, who's now the new economic advisor on the China stuff, he doesn't like that, but he's predicting, well, that's going to bring to the table, and we're going to have some negotiations, which is exactly what happened during the Clinton administration with China over tariffs. So none of these things I think are outside of the extreme. These are all kind of pretty normal policies. How he does it, how he says it, when he does it at 2 a.m. Yeah, unnerving. But I think part of his strategy is actually his inconsistency from that point of view, to throw everyone off and get and maneuver the debate in a way that gets him to where he wants to go. Remember, Reagan comes in, and everybody lambasted Reagan. Reagan had, just 2 or 3 big things he wanted to do. He wanted to rebuild the military, he wanted to get the economy going again, and he wanted to revive the American spirit.
Cut deficits.
And he was willing to spend for the sake of the military to get there, right? But my point being is that Trump's doing a billion things. He's all over the place. But at the end of the day, I think what he's interested in are probably just 2 or 3 things. And he sees a fight, he picks it, and then he goes on. Now, is that predictable? Is that in the norm? Is that the kind of behavior we like to see in presidents? No. But gee whiz, it seems to be going the right direction.
But it's exhausting. On top of everything else, it's exhausting. I cannot believe, we're only at the beginning of the 2nd year. Right?
But from the point of view of someone who's interested in politics, this is interesting politics. Politics was getting boring in my opinion. Let's start here.
Awesome. I'm glad you mentioned Trump's speech in Poland about the West. Because that seems to me something that's very big right now in America that maybe people who are a little older than me may not pick up on because, I'm still in college, so I kind of get exposed to all the intellectual trends of the moment. But what I see is really big is classical education, Western education, the history of the West. We need to return to this history of the West. And so it seems like Trump is onto that, and it might be kind of heretical to say this here at CWCTP, the Center for Western Civilization, Thought, and Policy. But to me, it seems it could be a little dangerous because you think back to even prior to the 19th century, right, like 17th, 18th centuries, where you have like England and the Puritans who kick out people who don't believe similarly religious. They compel them to believe what they do, or say they believe what they do, or else get kicked out, which is why our country's established. And I wonder if all this focus on the Western tradition is not a return, in some ways, an attempt to return to that sort of cultural purity or way of making the culture pure. I don't know if you have anything to comment on that. Do you think Trump's dangerous and that he might lead us down that path?
Can you comment on that first?
I don't think that Trump is. I think that earlier Matthew mentioned how he's a populist. He's definitely a populist, but I don't think he's that type that we've sometimes seen where there's some sort of cultural purity test. And also, in fact, Trump goes out of his way to say, my daughter converted to Judaism, I've got Jewish grandchildren. I think he's used improper language with respect to women, with respect to various minorities, but I think that comes from other parts of his character. I don't think it comes from some sort of, it's certainly not a philosophical attitude about cultural purity. In terms of potential problems with it, the way that he expressed himself in that speech, and we haven't heard him talk about the West a whole bunch of times other than that, I think he was talking about it in terms of just trying to say that the West, Western civilization broadly had built up all sorts of important political, economic, social, all sorts of faith. There's a big theme about faith in that speech, but it's not particular faith. It's just faith in general. So in some ways, it was really a speech arguing that secularization everywhere has perhaps gone too far, and the West is being attacked not only from without but also from within.
I think one of the reasons Trump won amplifies on Matt's point, that he identifies things. I don't think he has personal animus, malice. There's nothing in his history, but his election in part was a rebellion against political correctness. And a lot of people, even when they didn't like what he said in particular, sat there and said, finally, there's somebody who is not going to be chilled, intimidated, safe-spaced into being subservient. And I think one of the things that Trump has put on the table, and again, it's ugly oftentimes, and the way he does it, you don't like it, but he raises a very significant issue of elites being out of touch and speech being so chilled so that people have misconstrued silence for assent. A lot of people are angry in part because they feel, and I think with some justification, that elites, and this accounts for Brexit, this accounts for a lot of populism in Europe, and it accounts for Trump, this is not necessarily a bad thing to remind people that free speech should have a strong presumption. Even when you don't like what he says, there's something to his critique, even if you don't like the way he says it.
Although, but it does get to the rhetorical problem that Trump has. Think about how Reagan would deal with the same question. I mean, Trump's anti-political correctness, which I think is a very important element of his politics, also leaves him vulnerable to a lot of parts of that which are very unattractive. All this stuff with the alt-right and the white supremacy groups that latched onto him, which I don't think I don't think he really cared about that. And I think it's largely been expunged, but that did him no good, and he should have said something and been able to articulate a vision that defined that out of what he stood for.
That's true.
Because it leaves you with this sense that somehow Western civilization, or defense of Western civilization, must mean that, because you've not been able to articulate the difference between them. The defense of Western civilization, rightly understood, means the defense of regimes of the rule of law that uphold the natural human equality of men in the way the American regime represents at its best. And that's where Reagan was able to articulate that in a beautiful way. So from a policy point of view, Reagan wanted to control the borders. He wanted to get control of our immigration system in a way that defined what a citizen was, right? That's Trump's policy as well. The particulars of how to do it, maybe there's some differences in particular policies, but not that many that you might think. Having said that, Reagan always made the argument that we do this because in citizenship is important, and maintaining that is important, because we want to maintain the ability, the principle that all men are equal and that anyone could become an American. As he made the positive argument for immigration at the same time.
Yeah.
And Trump has not done that. And I think that's his chief weakness that leads us, I think, wrongly to conclude that, and I'm not saying this is your conclusion, but that somehow making these arguments for the West or for America or for the nation necessarily means that that side of nationalism, which is not the true and optimistic and American sense of nationalism that is defendable. And if he could articulate that in a way that was politically viable, I think he'd actually be much more successful than he is now, because he would attract a lot more people who are reluctant precisely because of those things. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm a huge Trump fan, so sometimes I have to say, I hear a lot of, from you all, a lot of kind of, he's okay, but it's kind of hard to listen to it, because actually I think that, I love what he's doing. When you talk about reputation, and I don't want to sound like I don't care about someone's morals or reputation,
Sure.
but I find it very interesting that, up until now, our society has pretty much allowed politicians a long reign. It reigns in that way. Whether you look at the Kennedys, whether you look at Martin Luther King, whether you look at Clinton. And it's really, to me, I think that we're asking, because of the relationship that, how badly the Democrats hate Trump, I think they are trying to expose even something that looks slightly like a potential rumor, they build it up to be a truth. And so I don't think that, I think that the battle that he has to fight is somewhat unfair compared to what other politicians have had to fight. And I think those things are important. I don't want to say they're not. But why has our society always, in the past, looked past those and judged someone also on their capabilities and not just on their reputation? And the last thing I just want to say quickly, I'm sorry, I'm taking more, but which one of you said something about a zero-sum game? Yeah. So I really don't see how, I'd like to hear how you explain it, because I feel like he is a master at making it a win-win for everyone. I mean, eventually, like whether the speech that he gave in Riyadh, or even in Poland, where he's having everyone become more accountable, but by becoming more accountable, they're buying in, and ultimately it's going to be a win-win for everyone. We're going to continue supporting them, but only if they carry their weight. And I mean, I think whether you see it in the prosperity argument, in the trading argument, he's not going to get these trading agreements signed if there's not a win-win for everyone. And I think we're beginning to see that break down into the, like with Seoul, with a win-win for each one of them, but on an individual basis. So I find it very curious, Elizabeth, that you find that he's a zero-sum person when I feel like his whole thing is based on a win-win for everyone.
So
sorry I took so much time.
Great questions. I think your first set of questions and comments really points us to something that we haven't talked about at all, which is the role of media in today's world. And so first of all, it's 24/7. I mean, it's more than 24/7. What's more than 24/7? It's more than 24/7. And the previous examples that you gave, we didn't have that kind of media. So we have to realize that that is a big change. And then now we have a president who participates in that 24/7 media, who doesn't seem to need to sleep, or sleep much. He's constantly commenting, so he feeds the maw, and they have more and more and more. And then you're right, everything gets parsed, everything gets looked at, and that points to the nature of the 24/7 media. And there are going to be political disagreements and debates about the political cast of the mass media. But if you look at studies of the mass media, it is still much more liberal than conservative. It's dominated by more. So for every time somebody says, but then there's Rush Limbaugh, or then there's this conservative columnist, or that, or Fox News, they are drops in the ocean compared to the dominance by liberals in the media. So that's who's talking about him, writing about him, broadcasting about him, tweeting about him, blogging about him, vlogging about, you name it, all the time. So I think a lot of what you're talking about in that first set of questions and comments is that. And then on the zero-sum game, that was when I was talking about his notion of success, his understanding of success, and that he sees winners and losers, he sees wins and losses. So I do think especially with allies, which I've been glad to see him talk more about allies over time. He is trying to encourage it as a win-win rather than a win-loss. But in foreign policy and international relations, it's become very popular among many, not all, to say, well, there shouldn't be winners and losers in international relations. It should be more cooperative, collaborative. We should get potential and actual foes to the table and make them comfortable and negotiate with them and end up with something like, the Iran deal, or potentially an agreement with North Korea. And I think in that area, Trump doesn't see win-win. I think he actually sees antagonists, he sees foes, he sees enemies, and he thinks that the United States and its allies are doing better in one area than those that are against it. The revisionist powers, the hostile powers, whoever they may be, will be losing.
But you don't think he had to offer something to Kim Jong-un in order to bring him to the table? Potentially opening his market, potentially...
He may be offering something. I don't know, but I think the peace through strength argument means that if he's going to negotiate, it's only going to be from a position of overwhelming strength in Trump's mind.
Jane, love is blind.
I mean, a slight modification. It's not that he's win-win or that he's a zero-sum game. It's that we win more than they win.
Okay.
So at North Korea, sure, he's offering him something. But I mean, he's going to make sure at the end of the day, we're better off, which means that guy is not going to be a threat to us in the way he was in the past.
Jane,
and that's the kind of assessment I think he needs.
And what Matt says about immigration, Trump makes trouble for himself because there's a much more principled case We are a nation of immigrants. We believe in legal immigration. We support assimilation. But if you sound like Trump often sounds, denigrating the objectivity of a Mexican judge, calling countries shithole countries, you're not only confounding our best principles, it's a loser. You cannot treat categories of people, particularly Hispanics, as if they are the problem because of where they're from. Given the demographics of the United States, you have to make a positive case. And one of the problems that Trump has is he makes legitimate points like the importance of sovereignty and immigration in a way that undermines the credibility of the case. And you can blame some of it on the media, but a lot of it is self-inflicted and organic, and that's a problem. And if we're going to win, you have to admit the problems are your own.
Here's how I would put it. I think a lot of the stuff that he's being criticized for are either just out and out distractions. The media is clearly biased. I think we haven't brought up all the stuff about Russian collusion and those investigations, which I think are absurd, and there's nothing to it. He's in the middle of a political battle, a life or death political battle. The left sees an existential threat. All that is true. And he, I think, is the right man right now to fight that battle. Absolutely true. But that's a prudential judgment. But the question, which I think we need to think about if we truly want to save this country, is what do we need to actually accomplish the larger objective, which is not merely to in the short run, win certain key battles and break down the administrative state and get judges on the courts. We want to play this out in a way that actually realigns American politics, right? He's a de-aligning figure. He's drawing lines, and that's good to do right now. But to become a realigning figure, he needs to actually also make a positive argument that attracts more people into the fold. He's not shown, I think, an interest or an ability or a willingness or whatever we want to say to do that yet, and to be a true kind of a figure that changes the course of American politics in a way that will continue. I think he needs to do that, and that's not yet. I've not seen that yet.
One more question, and then we'll have a
You pick the last question. I'm not going to pick the last.
It's not going to be you. Go ahead.
Thank you. The lady anticipated some of my part of my question. When you, Elizabeth, say that you're concerned about him tarnishing the office, and then we talk about the media, expanding every perceived or real sin of his. I think, in a way, you're underestimating Trump on several levels. One is that in office, he hasn't done anything to tarnish the office in the way that Clinton literally tarnished the Oval Office. And so for the conservatives there seems to be this obligatory, yes, Trump's a bad character, but there are some redeeming features approach of conservatives to talking about Trump. And that implies a kind of a buy-in to this sort of moral superiority of the other side, so to speak, of the liberal, who have none, and have had none through various presidencies, if you want to talk about the presidency, et cetera, so that it's interesting and curious, I think, to people like myself, and perhaps the lady who raised the issue, that the conservatives seem so willing to accept this sort of assault on Trump's character as if he's uniquely bad in some ways that, by implication, previous presidents have not been. If the Oval Office is not tarnished by now.
Right. Yep.
Jefferson and Sally.
You've answered your own question. What we know, and a lot of things we don't know, we can't see the interior of someone else's soul, right? I mean, but what you just answered your own question. He has the character of a politician. It's good, it's bad, I don't know, but that's right. But it's good enough for now. I can't sit here and say he's got a sterling character. I can't say he's got a bad character. He's done nothing in the presidency that Clinton has done. That's a very good point. But having said that, I don't think that's the central question right now.
No, I was just responding, though, to Elizabeth saying that was one of her, when Bob asked you each to say, what is your biggest fear? And she said her biggest fear was that Trump would tarnish the office.
And I would like to say, it's wood, so I don't know what it will do. But when I look at Trump and what I do know of him, right now there are aspects of him that seem to be more like, LBJ, Nixon, Clinton, and I'd like a little more Truman and Reagan.
A lot.
You're listening with a whole different
Let's
than the rest of us.
give these two panelists a great round of applause.